Right, hello everybody, and I would just like to quickly introduce a very special interview that we are doing today with John Lawlor, who is head of the NTW and its chief executive. With me is our contributor Becky, and obviously you know me as Victoria, who is a contributor to the show and also producer. And also we have Amy, who is a very prolific blogger.
Hi, my name's Amy Wilson. I run the mental health blog I'm Not Disordered, and I've just come along today to hear what John has to say, and I will be blogging about the interview, and also there'll be a YouTube video which I'm sure we can link in at the end of the interview.
Okay, thank you. So just to open, basically starting from the beginning, obviously mental health, mental illness touches us all in some way, whether it's as a personal experience or the experience of a friend, a colleague, a loved one. I myself suffer from borderline personality disorder. We actually do have another contributor, Sophie, who's not able to be here today, and obviously it's quite a universal issue. So perhaps if you were able to tell us some of your own personal experiences with mental health issues.
Yep. I'm very open with people, and in fact I was open with the CHEM before I even applied for the job that I've suffered for quite a number of years with a depressive illness that fortunately goes away for a bit and then comes with greater vengeance, and I do actually sort of have suicidal thoughts. So that's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about doing the job. I've been here nearly a year now, and I've been working in the public sector for 31 years, and this is the most enjoyable job I've ever done.
Fantastic. Thank you for your openness and your honesty. Looking at our first issue, this phrase, parity of esteem, I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit and tell us a little bit about what it means to the NTW.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's an unfortunate phrase because I think it's a bit clumsy, but effectively for me it means three things. I think nationally it means primarily that mental health issues and physical health issues should be treated as equals. So I think that's one dynamic. I think the second dynamic for me though is about therefore how do we make sure that the money is equally prioritised in the same way, and that's still, should we say, work in progress. And then I think the third thing is this thing about people being able to feel comfortable about talking about mental health issues in the way that they generally are with physical health issues. I would say, for example, people are generally relatively relaxed about talking about, I don't know, hip surgery. But if somebody goes in to see a service, to see a community psychiatric nurse or a psychiatrist, even if they would like to be open about it, they feel there's potential implications for their work, their family, etc. So I think the third bit for me is about parity of, how should we say, parity of ability to be able to talk openly about physical health and mental health issues equally.
That's fantastic, thank you. Looking at the vision, mission and values of the NTW, could you perhaps expand a little bit on what those mean to you personally, and perhaps tie that in slightly with how that links with this idea of the parity of esteem and the equality between mental and physical health services?
Sure. I mean, the organisation's sort of quite complex. It serves 1.4 million people. It's got 6,000 staff, and we spend £300 million a year. I say that more by way of context because I think the vision is around trying to deliver world-class services, and that sounds perhaps a bit naff, but what it really means is that we should always be looking to move from good to better to best. And I think probably one of the things that makes my job so enjoyable and humbling is that I don't think I've met a single member of staff that isn't absolutely passionate about doing the best they can for people. Nobody in this organisation, I think nobody in most organisations come to work to do a bad thing. And I've worked in a number of NHS organisations, and I would say this is the place where I've met the most inspirational members of staff. So I think that's probably the bit about what the organisation's trying to do. I think how that links with parity of esteem, I'll give you a practical example. We've had a huge focus over the last couple of years in monitoring people who are in our mental health services, particularly our inpatient services, but more broadly, their physical health conditions. So diabetes, respiratory issues, cardiac issues. And the whole point of that is to try and make sure that once we have all that information routinely collected, we can ensure that their physical health needs are prioritised just as if they were living in the community and they were going to access a service through their GP. So that's a really good example of practically trying to say, because somebody happens to have a mental health issue and we're working with them, why should their physical health needs not be addressed just the same as anybody else's? So that's a really obvious current example for us.
Thank you. Just to sort of throw one of your own quotes back at you a little bit.
Oh dear, what did I say?
A career with the NTW goes further than the job. It's living in and around the people we serve and embracing the places that make the area so special. Do you stand by that quote still?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, definitely. I think the challenge for me as the Chief Exec is to try and make sure that the people that are here to do the job get the maximum support possible from people like me. And so therefore there's a real tension about how do we make sure that the money doesn't sort of drive what we do, and that the various different targets were set by government doesn't drive what we do. So I think the way I would link it back to what I said is trying to make sure that every single person comes into work believing that this organisation is trying to help them do the job to the best of their ability. That might sound a bit sort of trite, but I think that's partly what the thing about delivering world-class services means, really. And you will find staff, and I'm very happy for you to come and talk to staff and meet staff and service users. You will find staff that feel that actually the reality on the ground is pretty tough these days, and so they would probably say, it's all well and good for him to say that. But I would hope that they would say to you also that the organisation is very, very patient-focused, service user-focused, and we hardly ever talk about what's happening with the money, because actually that's just the currency through which we deliver services.
I mean, there will be listeners, and there certainly are contributors to the show who perhaps have had negative experiences with particular individual members of staff. I think it would be impossible to criticise the service as a whole. I myself have had some extremely positive experiences while I was receiving treatment in South Tyneside. I went through the DBT programme, I had a very supportive CPN, and my experiences were very positive. But just how, if you could speak directly to those people now who have been perhaps disillusioned and perhaps have had negative experiences, as is the case in all large organisations, in education, in policing, in through mental and physical health services, what would you say to them to sort of re-inspire them, to let them know that you care and that you are listening and that you are striving to make those improvements?
A few things really. I mean, the traditional answer would be about please complain. We would encourage people to complain. If anybody sort of complains and asks me to look into it, they will always get a personal reply from me. And I think probably that's the top end of things. A lot of people don't feel that they want to formally complain. I think the second thing is actually sort of make sure that they feed back. We have things like points of view, where actually there's a sort of a little sort of form that you can use to actually put either anonymously or putting your name and say this is the thing that we either found that we didn't like, and so all of that stuff gets fed into our sort of process, and we review that every month. And I think the bit about re-inspiring people and sort of giving them confidence to come back in, as it were, I think probably linked to what I said earlier about the commitment to the staff. I think we would want to make sure that people have had confidence in our services, and we will always say, is there a different profession you would like to see if they've lost confidence in an individual for whatever reason?
Thank you. I hope that that's made a difference to some of our contributors and to our listeners, that obviously you are taking these issues very seriously, and obviously the message is communication, and it has to be a two-way thing. Just sort of leading on from communication, looking at the differences in provision, for example, between the NTW and the TEWV, which is the service that serves sort of the south of the region. How do you work together in order to share best practice, cooperation, and particularly looking at not just this large scale communication and cooperation, but also on a small scale, for example, transition of provision for someone like myself who moved from the Tyneside area into the Durham area? How does that all work? How do you see the vision for that large and small scale?
A few bits of context first of all. We're very unusual in the North East. There are only two large NHS mental health providers. So if you look at Yorkshire and Humber, which is where I used to work, there are 7. So we're actually very large, sort of sprawling organisations, which has its advantages and its disadvantages. I think the advantage is that there's the ability, if you like, to share good practice across our 6 localities, as there is at Tees, Esquimalt, Valley. So that's one of the advantages. The disadvantage, obviously, is that people then might feel there's not a great choice. So one of the things that we do together, Martin Barkley and I, who's the Chief Executive at Tees and Weir Valley, is look at where are the things that we can actually learn from each other. So there are some things that we may actually sort of say, well, we'd like to do that, and they'd like to do that, so we actually have to go through tendering processes, and one of us will come out the other side with the contract. But that's very much the exception, not the rule. It's all about working together and learning things from each other. So, for example, our Director of Nursing and Operations, he meets regularly with his opposite number at Tees and Weir Valley. We're actually, I think it's in 2 weeks' time, having a joint exec team meeting between Martin's organisation and ours. So that's at sort of like the big level, if you like. At a more operational level, you're quite right. There are some services that we provide, and then there may be a more specialist element to it that Tees and Weir Valley provide, and vice versa. So one of the really important things is how we try and make sure people don't fall between the cracks. So to give you a really practical example, we deliver a range of eating disorder services, and so does Tees and Weir Valley. The large majority of the inpatient facilities for people who've got quite severe experiences of eating disorders are actually provided in the south of the patch. So one of our key jobs is to make sure that if somebody's in our service that we feel needs to be admitted into a ward, that there's really, really good clinical dialogue going on between them. So that's a really practical example of what happens. But you're quite right, it's a hard thing to sort of do. But I can give people confidence that the two organisations work well together, and we're constantly trying to look at other things we can do better. So, for example, we've been looking at some of the things that Martin's organisation have been doing around their sort of transformation work, and they've been to see what we're doing in the Sunderland South Tyneside patch. And to be honest, it's broader than that. Most of the mental health trusts across the country, there are 59 big NHS mental health providers. We get together regularly as chairs and chief executives across the NHS. I think it's every other month. So there is a desire to try and make sure that we're all, if you like, learning from each other. But probably the other thing to say with all that is actually the evidence base around what works is still developing. I think that the research focus over the years has been much more on physical health, things like cancer and other such physical health conditions. It's sort of like becoming much more a priority now for government, for policy makers, for the NHS. So we're now actually starting to see things that we know works. So I could sort of give you some examples of that perhaps later.
Thank you.
That's a good question. Saying that about eating disorder services and how they have better sort of inpatient facilities, do you think that's acceptable though, that you're able to transfer them and that it's not in our area?
Yeah, and it's a really good point, because I think I would describe inpatient eating disorder services as a very highly specialised service. So I think the key thing, I entirely get the point that people wouldn't want to travel too far, having the expertise of the nursing staff, the medics, the OTs, the physiotherapists, the dietitians, access to the physical health services in one location guarantees, absolutely first-rate services. Whereas if you try and provide a small version in each locality, it's locally accessible, but it's definitely not going to be as good a sort of a service, and therefore there's a risk that you won't get as rapid a recovery. So it's always a tension: how much do you have in local patches, and how much do you centralise? It's a bit like, if I give an example, in Newcastle Teaching Hospitals. Newcastle Teaching Hospital provide transplantation for children with congenital heart problems. There are only 2 places in the country that do that. So it's just an example of where, and I would describe something like an inpatient eating disorder services, not quite that specialised, but there's a relatively small number of places in the country. But I think it's a very fair question, because we do certainly have some challenges from local service users and carers about why do I have to go to the south of the patch. And partly because of that, we do actually have 5 inpatient beds locally, so that wherever possible for people that haven't got the most complex needs are actually able to be supported locally.
How do you feel about the division of services between urban areas and rural areas? Because obviously there are quite a lot of our contributors and listeners from the rural areas of Northumberland and Durham who may feel that they are neglected or ignored in terms of services. Sort of tying in with what you're saying about, do you centralise or localise, especially for those people for whom travel may be difficult, particularly if they are suffering from anxiety or other mental health conditions that sort of restrict their mobility. How does the Trust see that?
Yeah, and it's one of our big challenges actually, because most of the population we serve are in quite urban areas, Newcastle, Sunderland, etc. Northumberland, south of Sunderland are our two patches that are very, very rural. Obviously the north of Northumberland is a particular challenge in Berwick, in Alnwick, etc. But just give you a practical example of what the problem is. The Northumberland commissioners, people that actually spend the money on health services, they don't get paid any more money because of the geography. Whereas if we were in an urban area, we would normally have 3 community mental health teams for the population that's in Northumberland. We need 4 because of the geography. So it immediately puts a challenge into us in terms of how to deliver the service and to the people that pay for the service. So it's probably true that we're not able to guarantee as accessible a service for people in very rural areas. Having said all that, what we are doing is trying to make sure that, it's an awful phrase, but there are hubs where the services are provided from. And I think probably the other thing that I would say is an awful lot of the people that we support, actually we support in their own homes. So unlike, say, a hospital service, a lot of people actually, we go to them rather than them having to come to us. But I think going back to the broader point, I think it is quite a challenge to make sure that what's available and how accessible it is to people who live in rural areas is at least the same, if not, at least as good as what happens in urban areas. So to give you a practical example, we're able to deliver services in Sunderland from just 2 locations, the vast majority of our sort of hospital type services. In Northumberland, if you wanted to make sure that services, people only have to travel about the same distance, probably need about 8 to 10 locations. So that's the issue really, it's how do you get the balance right?
Right, thank you. Before I hand over to Becky, who has some questions from our presenting and editorial team and the wider radio group, I'd just like to sort of say, where do you see the NTW's greatest successes since you joined as Chief Executive, and where do you see the greatest need for improvement and development as you continue in the role?
Well, first thing to say is that there's lots of great things, and I can't take any credit for it because I've not been here a year yet. I think some of the things that we're really, really good at, and perhaps we don't shout enough about, is some of the changes that we've been making to our community services. We started in Sunderland South Tyneside, huge numbers of service users and carers involved, right from the beginning saying how they would like to see our community services work. That led to commitments to making sure that people could access the service 24/7, there were telephone access, guarantees that there would be a multidisciplinary assessment of their needs within a week or 2, etc. And that's sort of like a consistent system that's now in place. We're in the process of trying to work out how to do something similar in each of the other 4 localities, Northumberland, Newcastle, Gateshead, North Tyneside. So that's something I think we're really proud of, is not just how it's going, but how many service users and carers were actually involved right from the beginning, and not just consulted, actually involved in designing it, so we could introduce you to some of the service users and carers who actually have been sitting there week in, week out, going through all of the things that are written all over the wall. We have sort of like a full wall of a room with all of the various different elements of how we try and make sure the services are joined up. So that's something I think we're really proud of, but just to be clear, that's quite tricky because we're actually requiring and expecting staff to change quite significantly the way that they've been used to working. And so some entirely naturally are quite nervous about it, some feel that we're potentially saying they've not been doing the job right, none of which is the intention. So that's something I think we're really proud of. Other things we're really proud of is we deliver some very highly specialised services, a bit linked to what I was saying earlier about things like eating disorders. We are an organisation that supports people with very, very complex needs who become very distressed. For example, we're one of only 2 organisations in the country that support people, young women and girls, teenage girls, who've been in significant trouble with the police. And we sort of have what's called a medium secure service, and it's literally just downstairs from here. And as I said, that's one of only 2 in the country. And sadly, for some of those folk, they've had such abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, sort of psychological abuse, that not surprisingly, they have a whole range of sort of troubling sort of conditions. Not so much troubling sort of like reactions to their condition. So that's something we're really proud of, is that we're prepared to take if you like, or to give services to just about anybody in the country. We take a lot of people from Scotland, for example. A lot of people sort of come to our service in Scotland. So I think that the sort of the highly specialised services we're very proud of, the transformation of community service, and then finally we've got some absolutely first-rate facilities. If you wanted to go and visit some of our very modern facilities, in this end of the patch in Morpeth, St George's Park is very new, and the new Showcase Hospital, which only opened last autumn, is in Hopewood Park, in south of Sunderland. And we've had sort of the Royal College of Psychiatrists come and say that they actually were wowed by it. So I think some of the facilities, but not because the buildings are nice, just because of the way that they're able to sort of get all of the staff working together. So I think that's a bit of a long answer. So I think those would be the bits. Things that we need to do better, everything, because you should never be satisfied. I have this just a personal thing that I carry around: good, better, best. If we're doing something good, that's not good enough, and it's quite difficult, because what you don't want to do is to make staff feel that you're not happy or you're not content with what they're doing. But I think there's a sort of desire to always, if you like, sort of be striving for the best, which is why we have this world-class services. We're not necessarily expecting to ever get there. We want to be constantly striving to be the best. So I think there's quite a lot we can always do. I think we're getting better at joining up services. I don't know whether any of your listeners have heard about things like street triage. Bit of a technical phrase. It effectively means that people that are in distress in the community may turn up at the A&E department, may be in a bad way in the community. We have a range of community psychiatric nurses who work with local police officers, and they actually sort of support people literally on the street, and then take them to the appropriate place, or indeed start to provide support to them there and then, as opposed to what used to happen in parts of the country, was people would be languishing in an A&E department until one of the mental health staff would come and see them. So that's an area where I think that we're still trying to work out how we avoid people getting so poorly that they end up having to be admitted to hospital, and then it takes longer to actually help them sort of come out the other side. So I think it's those things we'll constantly be sort of like challenging ourselves about.
I mean, it's understandable that the NTW is, a vast and very complicated organisation made up of individuals, some of whom may do their jobs better than others, and that's, part of any large organisation. Yeah. I think I probably wouldn't be forgiven by the team if I didn't sort of pass on that the areas where consistently we're hearing people have had negative experiences are in waiting times, which is very much parallel with the issues people have with physical health services, people who've had, distressing experiences with individual professionals, which you've already covered when you said people must complain and draw attention to this so it can be tackled. Don't suffer in silence.
Well, your point about waiting times is right, and I should have actually said that, because one of our big challenges has been waiting times into our young people services. There's been huge growth in people being referred into a specialist service by GPs, by teachers, and other sort of social workers. So we have a huge number of people that are being asked for us to see. What we've been trying to do, give an example in Northumberland, we had a very, very significant number of people that were waiting for months and months and months, even for their initial assessment. We've now, it's an awful phrase, we've now cleared the backlog, so people are all being seen within less than 12 weeks. So I would say that's an area that I should have mentioned earlier, that the pressure on waiting times because of demand growth is immense. Children's and young people services is, this sounds a bit like an excuse, one of the areas where we haven't trained enough specialists over the last decade. So we're actually all fishing in the same pond for specialist child psychiatrists, etc. So I would say, and I'm sure some of your listeners will sit there saying, well, actually, we know somebody who's been trying to access that service and been waiting for months and months and months. That has been true. Sadly, in a small number of our localities, it's still true, but I'm genuinely proud to say that we're making huge progress on that. I went to a meeting recently with a group of GPs in Northumberland, and they were saying that they understood that we had huge pressures on our specialist services, and what they were asking us to do, and I think that's a really practical thing, is sharing with them what the other network of services are. So if somebody is in need of support but not necessarily to see one of our specialists, where else can the GP refer them to? So I think part of our job is to better link up with third sector colleagues in a voluntary sector to say, how can we jointly provide services more?
Thank you. I mean, I think it's fair to say, and everyone would agree, that the NTW is obviously operating in an environment of, you know, unfortunate social stigma around mental health, obviously political change and upheaval, financial constraints. You've just mentioned there a skills shortage in particular areas. So I do think it would be unfair for anybody to blame the NTW for, you know, all of those things which it must obviously struggle against. But I think if we move on to Becky now, she's got some questions from some of our team.
Just to sort of shout out to start with, just like to say thank you to Helen, Alistair, Gareth, Bill and Sharon for contributing, as well as Lottie helping me last night put these together. So obviously you were just talking about most people being seen in less than 12 weeks. What is that the average waiting time now?
Yeah, I mean, it varies obviously from service to service. Generally we try and see people quicker than that, and we do the large majority. So nationally there are sort of set of waiting time standards that have been introduced for certain mental health services for the first time ever. So we've had for many, many years maximum waiting time standards for physical health services. So for a first outpatient appointment, for when somebody starts treatment following referral by a GP. We've only just, for the first time in the history of the NHS, had those introduced nationally for mental health services. So whilst it's going to be a big ask to meet some of those standards, we're really pleased because it actually sort of gets focus on it nationally, and frankly it also helps make sure that some more of the money comes into mental health services.
I was going to say actually, if you're being given targets, will that mean that you do actually have sort of financial implications if you don't meet these then?
Yes. So if I give you an example that I've already mentioned, and then I return to the one we just talked about, the two areas that we found it hardest to deliver on for our commissioners last year was what we call children's and young people's waiting times, what some organisations call child and adolescent mental health services. Just interested, the reason we don't call them child and adolescent mental health services because our service users said they didn't like it, because they thought it was stigmatising them by using that phrase. So just an interesting example where people have specifically said we'd like the services to be called something else. So that's an area where, linked to what we were just saying, we haven't been able to meet in every one of our 6 localities the waiting time standards we committed to. And the second one, which I just alluded to, which we've made huge progress this year on, is the physical health monitoring. So ensuring that everybody with a mental health need that's in touch with our services, that we do a range of physical health monitoring. So because of that, there is money attached, and so we have to try and agree with our commissioners that if we pulled out all the stops and not quite got there, will we still be paid the money? And so obviously the reason for doing it is not the money, but the way I describe it is that if we don't get the money, then we actually can't continue to deliver improving services. And to be fair to our sort of local clinical commission groups, they're pretty supportive. They recognise that for the vast majority of things we deliver them, and for those that we're struggling with, we can show what we're doing. So there's a big issue around money, but that's why actually, even though there's a risk of not getting paid, I'd much rather have challenging standards being applied to mental health services, because it's all back to that parity of esteem issue.
I know that sounds actually really great. A lot of my questions have obviously been about cuts because that's a major public concern at the moment. So I was just wondering what impact you would think that cutting services, as it were, would have on sort of other healthcare routes. Do you really think, obviously the money should be with you, but do you think it would have an impact on, say, GPs and A&E if it were to be cut?
I mean, I'd probably start with not so much the NHS. I think one of our biggest worries is what's happening to local authority social care funding and education funding, because unlike, say, sort of a short physical health problem where you might have, I don't know, need for a cataract operation, you'll be seen in the hospital, probably go home the same day, and you might only have one review appointment after that. For many of the people that we support, they will have quite a long relationship with our services, not everybody, and so for us the concern is mostly about what's the social care package that's around that person so they can stay living in the community with the appropriate support. So at the moment I would say our biggest worry is about what the impact is on the North East councils from the way that the money's being allocated to councils. The North East councils are particularly losers from the way it works, because there's a much greater focus now on age as opposed to deprivation. Not that there isn't some legitimacy for that, but it means that where there are the most deprived communities, sadly, people tend to die earlier than in the more affluent communities. So effectively, the northeast and other northern areas tend to sort of like get a smaller increase, or even worse, a bigger cut. So I'd start with that, local authority. Then from an NHS point of view, our problem is not so much whether we're getting sort of a real terms increase or not, it's the growth in demand associated with the ageing population, associated with what we just talked about in terms of pressures for young people, anxiety, eating disorders, depressive illnesses. So I think our problem is how to do not just the same with a bit less, but a lot more with a bit less. So I think that's our sort of constant challenge. And just to give an example of what the numbers mean, if we're asked to deliver a 3% cash releasing efficiency, which is horrible terminology, but basically the way I describe it to staff is, if we have to do that, we have to deliver £9 million of services next year for free that we got paid for this year. And that's what the efficiency target means every year. So when you've got an organisation where 80% of your costs are staff, how do you make sure that you're not actually having to sort of reduce your staff? Because obviously if you reduce your staff, you're going to be at risk of delivering less good services. So that's why the trying to get some extra money in is really, really important. Not because we want loads of money, but because money equals staff.
So with talk of obviously funding cuts across the board, but particularly in mental health services, it's quite a lot in the media at the moment. What areas do you feel would be most affected for you if you did have money reduced or staying at the same level, not increasing inflation?
I think what tends to happen is that I keep talking about them, the local clinical commission group, so that's what now, that's the local bodies that are responsible for sort of like deciding what services to spend money on, what they want those services to achieve. So what tends to happen is that they have huge pressures on their budget because they have to decide how much to spend on GPs, how much to spend on hospital services, how much to spend on community nursing, how much to spend on mental health, how much to spend on disabilities. So the first stage of the risk to our services is how does the group of GPs and the managers that run the organisation decide which bits of money to spend less on, so which services to spend less on. So I think that tends to be the first point where you have the conversation. So our job is to then fight for the needs of the people we're here to serve. And so I think it's probably not very easy to say which ones are most at risk. It's more that issue. So if I give you an example, we have some services at the moment that are actually so distressed that actually we have 2-to-1 staffing all the time. So 2 members of staff supporting that person 24 hours a day. You can imagine, therefore, how much resource needs to be committed to that person. So there's a tension, therefore, for commissioners, as we call them. How much do they spend on the large majority of people with mild to moderate mental health issues, and how much do we spend on people with highly complex needs, and ensuring, if you like, that that person with highly complex needs has got just the same human rights as the rest. So I think I would probably say that there's a greater risk that we may not be able to provide as good a service for the small number of people with serious mental health issues if the current pattern of public spending continues.
Okay. Well, obviously, part of the reason that it's been brought up for me was because there's been a lot of talk of cuts to, I was going to say CAMS, but obviously it's called something different here.
Children's and young people services.
Yes. And that's obviously sparked a lot of debate, including sort of petitions online. Yep. Do you feel like that sort of social pressure can actually reduce the perceived threat to these services?
Yeah, I do, and a bit like what I was saying about having national targets, I think that anything, personally, that puts us under pressure actually helps us fight the corner of the people that we're here to serve. So I'm very much I might be a bit odd by this, I actually sort of quite welcome people being quite critical of us. So you were talking earlier about sort of people complaining, etc. What we quite like, as well as individual stories, is people actually coming and saying, this is what actually is happening here, this is what's happening for this particular group of people, so your blog would be a great example of that. Getting some real feedback to say, well actually, he might be saying all that, but that's not what's actually happening here. So I think getting that feedback and challenge, I think actually sort of going back to my good, better, best, the tension is for how people like me, when I say we want to hear that, we want to fix it, doesn't make staff feel that I'm not proud of what they do, or that I'm sort of like blaming them.
On the sort of vague subject of staff, something that came into my head when you were talking earlier about how you want to get your staff talking about their mental health and whatever. How have you found occupational health in the NHS has changed to reflect mental health issues?
Yeah, it's a good, I would say that certainly historically there was a great focus on what you call musculoskeletal sort of conditions, where so people have got sort of back problems, etc., etc. I would say certainly for our organisation there's a very significant focus. There's a very significant focus on sort of anxiety, depression, burnout, frankly. So we do have an occupational health service that does provide services to our sort of workforce, both directly and through sort of like, well, I suppose through accessing services. So for example, if somebody's got a sort of depressive illness, they can be referred into the local, what they call IAPT service, which is an awful phrase. It's improving access to psychological therapy. So it's basically people who can be supported by therapists who may or may not also find it help with their medication. So I would say there's a much greater focus on that. Are we getting to people quickly enough who are off work with those sorts of things? No. Are people yet feeling it's entirely okay to say that they're suffering with mental health issues? I think it's got a lot better, but I think there's still a long way to go. And for me, one of the big surprises coming into this area was how, even though people who work in mental health service every day know about it and understand it, how they're still quite reticent to talk about it. Because I sort of feel, well, if we can't ourselves feel comfortable talking about it, what hope have we got? But that's not meant to sound like a criticism. I think we are getting better. I mentioned before we started that we have these things called recovery colleges. They're opportunities for people, service users and carers and staff, to go along and talk about their issues, and also frankly to run some courses themselves. We talked earlier, didn't we, about the fact there are some things that we do locally in Newcastle, similarly in Sunderland, where effectively we just offer the facility, we make it available for free, and then folk come and run things there.
So, sorry, just to interrupt, but when you say about, you know, the recovery colleges and all these other services and your cooperation with the community and voluntary sector, it does sound like, despite the media insisting that, you know, services are being cut, we're losing this, we're losing that, and despite the fact that there are some genuine experiences out there for people with mental health issues who haven't been able to access the particular service they want or they feel they need, or they feel they haven't been quite informed correctly, what you're saying is actually quite a positive message that if you look for it and if it's publicised correctly, there are actually plenty of things going on, alternate things, different ways to engage again for those people who do feel perhaps that disengaging is their only option because they didn't get quite what they wanted, how they wanted, when they wanted.
And I think there's a few things in all that. I think the bit about, I think you mentioned like if they, you know, when they access it, I think there's a big responsibility of us, GPs, others, to make sure people know what's available and how to access it. So I mentioned earlier that we have this work going on in Sunderland South Tyneside, which can be rolled out across the rest of our patch, making sure that there's a guaranteed 24-hour single access number to be able to say, if I've got a mental health issue or I've got a concern about somebody who has, that's the way into the service. Whereas historically, mental health trusts have tended to have lots of different routes in. So that's the bit that's still work in progress. I think the positive bit, I would agree that I think there's lots of positives. But being really honest, we can see a day in the next 2 years where we'll be struggling to see how we're going to make sure we deliver at least as good a service as we do now without going into financial deficit. The board's quite clear, however, as am I, that if we've run out of things to look at to save money and deliver more, then we won't cut services. But we are in an unusual place in the northeast. We have two providers that are pretty stable, pretty sort of financially sound at the moment. So we haven't had, for example, lots of people having to be admitted into hospitals all up and down the country. We do have some people in our services at the moment because of a shortage of beds. I won't name the areas, but in parts of the country that are 300 miles away, currently having people that are in our service. So there are huge pressures across the mental health system at the moment through a combination of lots and lots of service changes, lots of commitment to try and work together, and frankly, relatively good investment in mental health services from our commissioners. We're in a pretty sound place, but if you came and asked me in 2 years' time, would I be able to be quite so positive? I'm a bit worried, put it that way.
So obviously you're talking about there are services that are referring to you, and you
Yes.
mentioned earlier that you're one of 2 trusts that are working with young women in trouble with the law. What sort of thoughts do you have on the sort of essential postcode lottery that
Yeah.
it can be perceived at the moment?
It's a really good point. We discuss it a lot internally because, of course, we serve 6 sort of local authority patches, and obviously the services all grew up over many years. There were different priorities in each of the localities, as is always the case in the NHS and in all large organisations. So there's a commitment as an organisation to trying to move to equity of access and of treatment and outcomes. The tension is, though, the people who actually pay for the service in each of those 6 localities are different. Some of them have a reasonable amount of money to spend, others have huge financial problems. Some have more interest in this particular area of service, say older people services. Some may have more interest in services for people with psychoses. So the actual ability to deliver a sort of equal service across the localities is really hard. And as you might expect, our clinicians sort of quite challenging to say, well, we don't think it's morally acceptable that we're offering a different service for this population than we are for that. So it's something that we have to keep trying to do the best with. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that one, because what we would be accused of doing is if we effectively subsidised a service with, I don't know, let's just say for argument's sake, Sunderland money by strengthening a service in Northumberland, then quite rightly the people that have got the responsibility for delivering service, for buying services for people in Sunderland would say, what are you doing spending my money over there? So that's why it's a real tension.
Yeah, because you mentioned obviously that you've got the same funding for Northumberland as
Yeah.
like
Other
more
localities.
urban areas.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And I think that issue is not peculiar to our patch, it's just an NHS issue generally. The difficult bit is, without getting technical, the way that the money flows is based upon an assessment of need. So the population, based upon its age, sex distribution, to a degree, poverty, etc. That's how the money's allocated. And there's not many other things that take account of differences in costs. So if it's more expensive to deliver a service in a much more sort of dispersed geography, there's some account taken, but nowhere near as much as that in an ideal world we'd want to be. And of course Northumberland's a good example because it's the least densely populated place in the country. So inevitably therefore it's an example of somewhere where we have the real extreme.
Well, sort of, you've mentioned obviously the ageing population a couple of times. Are you seeing increases in age-associated illnesses, even with obviously
Yes.
Northumberland sort of lower age expectancy? And how's this sort of impacting upon the services individuals receive?
Sure. A couple of bits about that. I think first of all, there's been a lot of attention in the NHS on what we call people with long-term conditions. I think that's been overly focused on people with physical health needs. So I have type 1 diabetes, so I'm going to live with type 1 diabetes for the rest of my days. Hopefully I'm not going to live with recurring depressive illness for the rest of my days. So I think what's tended to happen is we focused on long-term physical health conditions, and then alongside that we've had people suffering with dementia or living with dementia. And so what we have to do better is look at the person from the point of view of all of their needs, not sort of compartmentalising, saying these folk will deal with the person's dementia and these folk will deal with their other physical health needs. So I think the reason I mention that is 2 things. One, there's obviously an ageing population, so there's going to be more people with a range of long-term conditions. And then secondly, we know that a person that's suffering with a physical health condition and a mental health condition actually requires an awful lot more services. So we have to spend more money on each person like that. So I think that as well as the ageing thing, we've got to work out how to make sure that services like ours are joined up with services at Northumbria Trust, at Newcastle Teaching Hospitals, at City Hospital Sunderland, at the QE in Gateshead, at South Tyneside Trust. So I think, as well as the agency, it's about how do we join up physical health and mental health services.
And on the subject of dementia in particular, I'm currently studying at Newcastle University, so I'm sort of interested in how, whether you're still finding that new research does come to light improving treatments, and how does the potential for new research factor into the long-term plans for the Trust?
Yep, we're quite a research active organisation. What does that mean? We put forward sort of submissions, if you like, to be able to win research funding, often with other organisations, both nationally and globally, because it's quite a competitive process. There's a fixed amount generally of research funding, of which the proportion that's spent on mental health and learning disabilities issues is a relatively small proportion, but growing, so I'm not moaning about that. So the areas that we tend to focus on are ones that we're got expert academic clinicians, which means they do research and they also deliver services to patients, and things that the universities are strong at in terms of their research capacity and capability, and some of the acute trusts are good at. So three areas that we're really heavily involved in research is dementia, particularly into a type of dementia called Lewy body dementia. Sounds a bit technical, but effectively the expert academics that work locally, both for the university and for us, are the world leaders in research into that, and directly contributed to NICE guidelines that said, here's the evidence as to what interventions help. Second area that we're quite active is in autism services. There's a lot of work to do to understand what interventions work for people with autism. And so we're involved heavily with things like positive behavioural support, which is a particular sort of therapy that supports people, or also like, not so much therapy, sort of ways of supporting people. And then the third area is what's called the Regional Affective Disorder Service. So that's a specialist service for people like me that's got what you might call a complicated version of depression. And so that's another area we've got very active researchers. And I think the other reason I want to do research, as well as trying to improve services, it attracts the best. If we're known as being a very research active organisation, you tend to find it easier to attract, particularly psychiatrists, but other sort of professionals as well.
Sorry, I've just sort of stumbled there. I think my last thing to ask really was, obviously we talked earlier about you providing spaces and it being sort of up to voluntary organisations to sort of help with them. So sort of with many services from Samaritans through to things like Lifeline and student organisations like Nightline, relying on charitable contributions and volunteer support, how do you view that sort of voluntary community sector and the Trust working together?
A couple of things. I think that we generally have pretty good relationships with most of the third sector organisations across the piece. One of my personal priorities since I've come though is trying to work out how we deliver more services together. Because some of the voluntary sector are there quite rightly as sort of advocates and champions for people with mental health issues, with learning disabilities, with neurodisabilities, and that's great, and we need to be sort of working with and challenged by them. But there's also a number of them that are quite large providers of services in their own right. So where I want us to get to is actually sort of jointly providing more services, because there'll be some things that a small third sector organisation that's supporting a particular group of people with a particular condition, they're always going to be better. So like delivering that sort of bespoke service. So that's a sort of a thing that I'm out on manoeuvres on, if I can put it that way. I've been out to visit a number of the chief officers, chief execs of some of the third sector organisations to talk about how might we do that. But one of the challenges, of course, that their funding's potentially being cut. In one or two cases it has been. And secondly, which is one of my bees in my bonnet, if you try and get public to do charitable works, to get money, how many charitable events do you see for people with mental health issues compared to how many you see for people with cancer, with heart disease, etc. So there's a battle still to be won about helping people see what the benefits are of contributing towards third sector organisations that deliver mental health services.
It does seem a bit of a shame that you do need to rely on sort of the volunteers and people fundraising for it though. Do you think there is a real risk to their funding?
I would say that a small number have actually told us that their funding is being reduced, and I won't get into who's having to do that. But effectively what some of them are then saying to us is there things that you could support us with? So for example, there's this sort of like tendering process. So somebody will go out and say, this is the service that we would like to offer to this population. Here's the outcomes we want you to deliver. Tell us whether you can do it. And then a range of organisations might put in proposals to do that. So one of the things we've been talking about with a number of the third sector organisations locally is we have capacity and expertise to actually put responses to tenders together. So we're trying to look at how we might actually do that sort of thing to support, rather than necessarily being able to put direct money into it. Because obviously every penny we spend on something else, unless it's directly supporting our service users, means that we're not able to spend something on the ones that we're here to support.
Okay, finally, it's just a sort of overall sort of question with what would your ideal sort of holistic mental health service look like? What's your sort of vision of a perfect outcome?
Wow, yeah. Well, that's sort of quite easy to say, but quite hard to do. I would say that every single person should feel that they're being looked at as a whole person. That we're not saying somebody walks in the door and that's a schizophrenic person, that's a diabetic person, that's a bipolar person, that's a heart failure person. So I think there's quite a big cultural challenge for the NHS to make sure that we're looking at the whole person. And as I say, that's easily said. Nobody intends to not do that, but people are almost trained in saying, let's quickly get to a diagnosis. And that's right, because then you can work out what the best intervention is, but then it sort of sometimes makes you feel like you're having to go to loads of different places. So I think whole person. Secondly, linked to that, making sure that the physical health services, the mental health services and the social care services are looked at together at the same time by integrated teams of people that work together. And frankly, you can't join the, you can't see the cracks, because we have a system where local authorities provide most social care services, NHS provides most physical health services and mental health services, and so the ability to join those three together without seeing any cracks is has been a bit of a life's work for the NHS. I think Bevan would come back and say, thought we'd have made more progress than that in the last 70 years.
Okay, and what ways do you think you could achieve that? Because obviously that is coming back down to the sort of holistic look at a person, isn't it, with social care and obviously environmental factors. Is that something that's really, it's not easy to achieve?
Sure, well there's been quite a focus for, well all the time I've been in the NHS there's been a focus on integration, and that's meant different things at different times. In terms of a practical thing, there's a thing I just mentioned about getting community staff with mental health expertise, with learning disability expertise, with physical health expertise, with social care expertise, working almost like in one virtual organisation, so forget who's the pay and rations person. So that's one bit. I think the second bit practically is we've got a number of clinical discussions going on between clinicians in the acute trust and our clinicians about saying, how do we effectively join up what we do? So the conversation I had with two of the chief executives is that forget the complexity of we'll have a contract with you. Let's just get some clinical staff sitting around the table and saying, right, we have a range of people who are in our inpatient wards. Why can't some of you as physicians come and do ward rounds on our wards, rather than the person having to go into the acute trust when they have a physical health need? And the quid pro quo would be that some of our psychologists and some of our psychiatrists, if necessary, would actually be in the outpatient clinics in the hospitals. So, for example, a person that's been diagnosed with cancer, yes, there's the initial shock. There's then all the treatment that can be quite both psychologically and physically draining, whether it be radiotherapy or chemotherapy. And then after all of that, you can actually get into quite a downward spiral and become quite depressed. So part of our offer would be to say, can we look at that person's mental health needs at the same time as what's the consequence, if you like, of the physical health condition.
That's absolutely brilliant. I think that's a really nice note to end on. Thank you ever so much for answering all that.
We should have put something on the door.
Very briefly, where do you see the role of prevention in mental health? Because obviously a lot of the emphasis does go on recovery and treatment, but obviously with physical health we do talk a lot about prevention, about weight loss, about anti-smoking campaigns, highlighting the dangers of drugs and alcohol, you know, trying to catch people before these things become an issue. Where do you see the NTW in terms of promoting prevention strategies and, you know, actually being involved in prevention services?
Yeah, and it's sort of like the really, really big question for all of society. I think we've got to a place now where people are actually, if you like, living lifestyles that will actually lead over the next decade or so for people's life expectancy to actually reduce compared to what's been before. That'll be the first time that we'll get to that place. And some of that's to do with obesity, some of that's to do with exercise, some of that's to do with diet, some of that's to do with smoking. So I think there's the general thing that all of us have got to take a bit more responsibility for around how do we actually sort of recognise that we're not doing ourselves any good. And that's hard, and so various different governments have tried. When people have tried to be, when governments have tried to be really, really clear and say you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, they get accused of being a nanny state. And when governments say we'll just leave the various different local businesses, etc., to join into voluntary programs, that's not that effective. So there's a big societal sort of social movement stuff. Secondly, then, what we've got to do, along with GPs and other what you would call universal providers of services, to make sure we're spending more time on the catching people early, if I can put it that way, so that there's less need to have lots of people actually in highly specialist services. Just to give you a sort of perhaps quite shocking statistic, 3% of the people that we support in any given year need to be in inpatient care. What percentage of the money do you think we spend on our inpatient services?
Half.
Not bad, 55%. So for 3% of the people we support, 55% of the resources we have is supporting them. And so one of the big issues linked to your point about prevention is, can we get a bit more of that money spent upstream to therefore be able to reduce the number of people that need to have an inpatient stay. Don't get me wrong, inpatient stays are necessary for some people and actually can be very successful, but it's just that actually that should be the line of last resort, if you like, rather than being the first resort. But we have made huge progress over the last few decades in reducing significantly the number of people that spend any time, any significant time in inpatient care.
Okay, well, I want to obviously offer our huge thanks for your time today on behalf of Becky, myself, Victoria, and our visiting blogger, Amy. You've been obviously amazing. You've been very frank and honest. I'm sure there will be listeners who perhaps disagree with some of your points, and by all means, we encourage them to email in or use our social media sites in order to air their views, which obviously hopefully we'll be able to feed back to you and perhaps get some responses from yourself.
We'll hear, we'll happily sort of look at all of those, and we'll commit to trying to respond. Yeah, you're sitting here thinking thanks.
I think the very powerful message that you've obviously gotten out to all our listeners is that you are listening. You are very willing to hear them, to let them take ownership, and to let them have a voice and try and improve services. So it's fantastic that you're so open to that level of communication. And John Lawlor, Chief Executive of the NTW, we thank you for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.